Today's talk is entitled Part 2, Rare Disease Clinical Research, a deep dive into regulatory strategies and considerations. My name is Samaya, and I'll be your X-Talks moderator for today. Today's webinar will run for approximately 60 minutes with time for a question and answer session with our speakers. This webinar is designed to be interactive, and webinars work best when you're involved, so please feel free to submit questions and comments for our speakers throughout the presentation using the questions chat box, and we'll try to attend to your questions during the Q&A time. This chat box is located in the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. If you require any assistance, please contact me at any time by sending a message using this chat panel. At this time, all participants are in listen-only mode. Please also note that this event will be recorded and made available for streaming on xtalks.com. At this point, I'd like to thank Medpace who helped develop the content for this presentation. Medpace is a scientifically driven, global, full-service clinical contract research organization providing phase 1 to 4 clinical development services to the biotechnology, pharmaceutical, and medical device industries. Medpace's mission is to accelerate the global development of safe and effective medical therapeutics through its high science and disciplined operating approach that leverages local regulatory and deep therapeutic expertise across all major areas. Now, I'd like to have the pleasure of introducing our speakers for today's event. Our first speaker is Christina Wanderhaar. Christina Wanderhaar is a Senior Director in Regulatory Affairs with over 13 years of drug development experience. Christina's work in drug development includes experience developing and implementing successful regulatory strategies to support global applications for rare and orphan diseases that impact the pediatric population. She has led and attended multiple successful FDA meetings, including pre-IND and end-of-phase meetings across several divisions at the FDA. These experiences give her an in-depth understanding of global regulatory processes and allow her to lead and provide experienced insight into potential expedited and accelerated regulatory pathways. Our second speaker for today's webinar is Sargon Daniel. Sargon Daniel is an Associate Director of Regulatory Affairs with over 19 years in global regulatory affairs, including acquisitions, divestment, and product transfers. Sargon has worked in both pharmaceutical companies and contract research organizations, which has given him excellent rapport with a number of European agencies. Mainly focused on the EU and international markets, Sargon's work includes several successful applications for orphan drug designation and pediatric investigation plans. And now, without further ado, I'd like to hand over the presentation to our speakers. Christina, when you're ready, you can go ahead and get started.
Thank you, Samaya. Very much appreciated. And I appreciate all of you for joining us today as we do a deep dive into regulatory strategies and considerations for rare diseases. Today's agenda will include discussing expedited and accelerated pathways both in the United States and in Europe. We'll discuss the overall requirements for these pathways as well as timing and how meetings with regulatory authorities in the US and EU can help to move forward with development in these rare and orphan diseases. We'll also spend some time discussing pediatrics, including rare diseases in pediatric indications, as well as how pediatrics fit into the overall development plan. So to begin, we're going to talk a little bit about the why, the what, and the how of global accelerated drug development, particularly as it relates to rare and orphan diseases. So beginning with the why do we look at global accelerated drug development? We're looking to expedite the development of new drugs and biologics for rare and orphan diseases in order to be able to address serious unmet medical needs as well as treat those rare diseases. We're also ultimately looking to accelerate the approval of new drugs and biologics in this space in order that we can get new therapies to the patients that really need them. What does this mean and how do we achieve it? So beginning with what, we're looking specifically at different expedited pathways and designations that can be utilized to increase interactions with regulatory authorities around the world. We're also using accelerated and conditional approvals to achieve earlier time to development to get these therapies to patients. There are orphan considerations as well as pediatric considerations in this space. Finally, how do we achieve these aims? One of the key ways that we do this is through scientific advice meetings, particularly with US and EU regulators. We always want to make sure that we're taking a global mindset when we're considering drug development considerations, and we want to make sure that we understand the implications of receiving scientific advice, both from the US FDA as well as EU EMA and/or national competent authorities. We can also achieve these measures through orphan designations, both in the US and in the EU. We can also achieve this through expedited pathway designations, which we'll spend quite a bit of time discussing, as well as rare disease vouchers in the United States, and then finally, we'll go through accelerated and conditional approvals. I want to begin by discussing expedited and accelerated pathways, key concepts in the United States. Before we discuss what can be utilized for expedited and accelerated development for rare and orphan diseases, we need to understand what the key concepts are and how we need to address each one of those considerations and applications to the regulators. So in the US, a serious condition has been defined as a disease or condition associated with morbidity that has substantial impact on day-to-day functioning. As we're beginning to discuss through scientific advice with regulators how we're going to address an unmet medical need for a rare disease, we first need to lay out why we're looking to treat this potentially serious condition. And in some cases, while it may be fairly obvious that it is a serious condition, we need to go through and ensure we understand the most recent literature on the disease, as well as the treatment paradigms, and present those to the regulators. We also need to clearly state that we intend to treat the specific indication that we are looking to eventually receive marketing approval for. And this is a very important concept that we need to ensure that has been addressed. And while it may seem obvious if we're going for an orphan designation or a fast-track designation that we intend to treat that population, we need to clearly state it, and we need to ensure that our clinical development plan, as well as our overall development plan, supports intending to treat that particular indication. There's also needs to be an understanding of what the available therapy is for the current population. This includes both approved drugs as well as potentially some unapproved drugs that are potentially used off-label for these indications. It's really key to understand the competitive landscape in terms of available therapy so that we can highlight potential areas where the new therapy may be more efficacious, more safe, demonstrate superiority compared to those available therapy. And so as we continue to discuss, it's important to keep in mind that you have to work within the larger context of the competitive landscape and not just understand your own product. And then finally, we need to be able to address the unmet medical need. And this might be through superiority compared to available products. It might be through having a better safety profile, or it might be that you're in an indication that don't have any available therapies, and so you're simply addressing a patient population that currently is not treated at all. These are the key concepts. As we go through the rest of the slides, it's important to keep these in mind because we'll keep reiterating when we talk about timing and different aspects of these designations that each one of these conditions needs to be met. Next, we're going to discuss the US FDA expedited programs, beginning with Fast Track. So Fast Track includes actions to expedite development and review, as well as rolling review. Some key criteria for Fast Track include the ability to address an unmet medical need in a serious condition. What's important to recognize for Fast Track is that it does not require clinical data with the application to support the designation itself. Therefore, oftentimes, this designation may be the first one requested because it can be requested earlier in development. We'll talk more specifically about timing for some of these a little bit later on, but Fast Track is one that typically requires the least amount of data and therefore can occur the earliest in development. Next is breakthrough therapy. Some of the main advantages of breakthrough therapy include intensive guidance on efficient drug development, organizational commitment from FDA, rolling review, and other actions to expedite review. Breakthrough therapy is a key designation for a lot of different indications, particularly in oncology, and particularly when we're looking at rare and orphan spaces, because it really does provide that additional guidance from FDA. And when we talk about scientific advice, you'll see, for example, that breakthrough therapy designated products are eligible for Type B meetings that fall within the 60-day window instead of, for example, a Type C meeting in different scenarios. So you're shortening, in some scenarios, the amount of time it takes to get FDA feedback, and this is very key and important for a lot of therapies. However, it's also important to understand for breakthrough therapy that there is a requirement for some clinical data to support efficacy with the product. Therefore, this tends to occur later in development, so it's important to understanding the timing so that you get the maximum amount of benefit from the designation. Next, we have accelerated approval, which is approval based on a surrogate endpoint or intermediate endpoint expected to predict clinical benefit. Again, this is a very popular pathway for oncology indications. However, it can be utilized in several different therapeutic areas. These next designations tend to be more specific to particular therapeutic areas or indications, and we'll start with qualified infectious disease product designation, which includes fast track designation as well as 5-year exclusivity extension for certain applications. Applications that would meet the requirements for QIDP include antibiotic or antifungal products that are intended to treat the list of qualifying pathogens as has been set forth by the United States Congress. These can be requested very early in development. However, the 5-year exclusivity extension would not be determined until the time of the marketing application itself. Also in the same infectious disease space is the limited population pathway for antibacterial and antifungal drugs. This application review takes into account the severity, rarity, or prevalence of the infection that the drug is intended to treat. So if you believe that you have a product that may be very beneficial for a very small or a rare population within a broader indication, or maybe a more severe population within a broader indication, then this is something that you would want to discuss with the agency, as it could help minimize the overall development plan for that particular program. Next, and one of the more recent designations, and one of the more popular right now, is the Regenerative Medicine Advanced Therapy designation, which includes all the breakthrough therapy features of that organizational commitment, more interaction with the agency. And in addition, this particular designation includes support for accelerated approval and satisfying post-approval requirements. So the agency is committed to working to understand and to help reach alignment on how this program can move forward to approval in order to get these therapies in place with patients. This is particularly important for rare and orphan diseases when we look at gene therapies. There's quite a bit of guidance that recently has come out for this particular designation. And so it's important, if you're working with an advanced therapy that you think qualifies, again, you will most likely need some clinical data in order to achieve this designation, but it's important to understand the timeline so that you can really get that beneficial feedback that will help advance you to the marketing stage while understanding what may be necessary post-approval. And then finally, we have priority review, which is shorter review of marketing applications. So these are the US FDA expedited programs as they currently stand. Now I want to talk a little bit about the US rare disease vouchers. There's a lot of information out there about the rare pediatric disease voucher. From a high level, the requirements are that at least 50% of the affected population is between 0 and 18 years of age, where the prevalence is lower than 200,000 overall. At the time of marketing approval for the pediatric indication, a voucher for priority review is issued, and yes, these vouchers may be transferred, and they frequently are. A couple things to understand about rare pediatric disease vouchers. First and foremost, it's important to understand that you really do have to demonstrate to the agency that you're intending to treat the rare pediatric disease itself, and that that disease manifests primarily in children between 0 and 18 years of age. While there may be some exceptions to that rule, overall, the agency is going to want to ensure that you are intending to treat that particular population. They're also going to require that you're not seeking an adult indication at the same time as that pediatric application is being submitted for review. Finally, from a timing perspective, rare pediatric disease vouchers currently must either be utilized, you must apply for them by September 30th of 2020, or you must have received the designation by September 30th of 2020 in order to have your application considered to be viable for this voucher. Now, of course, that is subject to change based upon additional legislation, but currently that is the requirement. Next is the rare tropical disease voucher, similar to the rare pediatric disease voucher. However, this is for tropical diseases. There is a list currently of tropical diseases that may fall under this category on the FDA website that you can view to understand if you may fall into this category. And again, at the time of marketing approval for the tropical disease indication, a voucher for priority review is issued. Now I'd like to spend a little bit of time discussing when it's appropriate to reach out to FDA to either discuss or submit these expedited applications. You'll notice on this slide that for most of these, the arrow continues throughout the drug development process, and there is a specific reason for that. We'll talk a little bit about when it makes the most sense to actually submit the application itself. But the reality is, for a lot of these designations and pathways, it's important to begin discussions with FDA early in development to signal your intent to be on a particular pathway. So for example, fast track designation requests, breakthrough therapy, QIDP, limited population pathways, and RMAT designations, while you may not be submitting those with the initial IND, and in the case of breakthrough and RMAT, you most certainly won't because you won't have clinical data at that time, you may wish to at least position your product as a breakthrough product, as an RMAT product, as a fast track product through, for example, a scientific advice pre-IND meeting with the FDA, at which time you begin laying the outline for your drug as a drug that's intended to treat a serious condition with an unmet medical need. Particularly if you're looking at certain pathways, such as a limited population pathway, it will be important to have alignment with FDA on your clinical development plan, as it may be much smaller than a typical development plan. It may include less patients, more restrictions in terms of inclusion and exclusion criteria, and so you'll want to ensure that you have alignment on the particular path before you would actually proceed or move forward with development in that way. There are some that occur later, such as accelerated approval, which typically will be discussed either in an end of phase 1, an end of phase 2 meeting as you move forward to ensure that you have alignment on the surrogate endpoint that will be utilized. And then finally, typically the last one to be discussed is priority review. Priority review is something that occurs for all marketing applications. So the FDA will review every application to determine if it meets the requirements for priority review. However, if you want to ensure that the agency is reviewing your application carefully, you are welcome to actually submit a request for priority review as part of your marketing application. And remember, for some of these other designations, you will qualify for priority review at the time of marketing application, assuming that you still qualify for the designation at that time. The other thing I would like to point out is that for many of the U.S. expedited designation requests, there are not necessarily template formats to be utilized. However, the agency does provide quite a bit of guidance around what should be included in these applications. And so it's important to review the most current guidance to ensure that you're checking the box for each listed section so that you don't either run into a technicality when FDA is reviewing your application or inadvertently miss a section. So for example, when we look at a fast track designation request, as I mentioned from the start with the key concept, we want to ensure that we're addressing the seriousness of the condition. We want to address available therapies, our intent to treat that serious condition, and the unmet medical needs that exist in that particular indication and population. We'll walk through each one of those sections to ensure that the content is there, that we've pulled the most appropriate and up-to-date literature references, any available preclinical data in order to support the application is included, and a lot of times this particular designation will be submitted with the initial IND request, and therefore you'll receive your feedback in 60 days. Most applications, including Fast Track, Breakthrough Therapy, QIDP, and RMAT, all will provide you with feedback within 60 days of the application submission itself. For a lot of these, if they are included in the initial IND submission, then again, you'll simply receive that feedback 30 days after that initial 30-day safety review period has passed. So now I would like to turn it over to Sargon, who's going to speak a little bit about the EU regulatory pathways and what we can expect from the European perspective.
Thank you, Christina. Yes, I'm basically going to be focusing on the EU regulatory pathways and mainly the EMA and how they interact and will advise us through different procedures. First, I'll start with the early engagement with the EMA, then looking at orphan drug designation, pediatric investigation plan, accelerated assessment, and finally the conditional marketing authorization. Next slide, please. So it's important to note that when you the importance is when dealing with the MEA is that you have an early engagement, an early conversation with them, an early meeting, scientific advice, really to go through your development program, and specific items can be discussed down to the quality, clinical, non-clinical, and different pathways that you wish to go down. I've mentioned prime and orphan, and obviously I'll go through the other items as well. With scientific advice, it's important to know that you will need to produce a briefing pack. This briefing pack is critical. It's an overview of your product, your development program to the EMA. So it has to be concise and specific. Pediatric plans can be discussed even at this early stage, but it's important to, and I will address that later along with the other slides with regards to pediatric plans. So in your briefing pack, as I said, concise and specific, but also you need to understand with scientific advice, planning, and the MEA do issue timelines when seeking scientific advice. So you have to understand, when they are, what occurs, what has to be done, and you have to be specific in the sense of knowing when you will have the scientific advice. So it's early. Really, what's important is early engagement with the MEA to discuss your development program. I've also mentioned the prime scheme. The prime scheme obviously has several advantages. It is something that you would approach the EMA very early in your development. Really, what's important here is the early engagement and the proactive, because you need them to look at your data, your robustness of your data, and also to look at the risks and benefits. With this, you have the discussion within this thing to discuss accelerated assessment of your application. Again, prime is aimed at improving clinical trial design. Prime also allows eligibility for accelerated assessment at time of the marketing authorization, and I'll come to that later. Also, you have to provide scientific advice. They'll be proven. They will provide scientific advice at key development milestones. So all through, if you are successful with the prime, you will have the milestone within your program development. You will have advice all the way through. Next slide, please. So I'm going to touch on the accelerated assessment. So really for accelerated assessment, it's really looking at it's when you make it, it's important when you submit, but also before you submit, you need to have a pre-submission meeting, at least 7 months before a submission for the accelerated assessment. Again, this touches base back to prime. When you are applying for prime, you can discuss this as well. You're seeking guidance from the MEA, so you need to understand what it means, and you are trying to justify the claim of your medicine product it will be needed, why it's unmet medical need. Next slide, please. And obviously, I'm looking at conditional market authorization. Again, this is aimed at treating, preventing, and diagnosing seriously liberating or life-threatening diseases. Applicants may be granted for supplements where the benefit of immediate available outweighs the risk of less comprehensive data. Again, unmet medical needs will be fulfilled, the benefit to public health. Again, with CMA, it is only valid for a conditional market authorization. It's only valid for 1 year, but it can be renewed annually. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Sargon.
I'll hand it back. Yeah.
Thank you, Sargon. So now we're going to talk a little bit about orphan drug development in rare disease. You may have noticed that earlier we hadn't discussed orphan drug and it was sort of glaringly missing. Now we're going to discuss it in the context of both the U.S. Food and Drug Administration as well as the European Medicines Agency, because while there are many similarities between the two when it comes to orphan drug development, there are some differences, and it's important to understand and highlight those. And this goes back to my earlier reference to understanding your development program within the global context, particularly for rare and orphan diseases, because as you will see here, you have to be able to cover both the U.S. requirements as well as the EU requirements in order to achieve those designations in both regions. So starting with the Food and Drug Administration, the main requirement is a disease prevalence of less than 200,000 or less than 7.5 in 10,000. There are rare circumstances where disease prevalence may be higher than $200,000. However, if there is no reasonable expectation that the cost of developing and making the drug will be recovered, then you may still qualify for the orphan designation. There needs to be enough information to establish a medically plausible basis that the drug will be effective. This may be achieved by using preclinical data. Of course, clinical data always makes for a stronger case. However, there may be scenarios for the U.S. FDA orphan designation where you might be able to use that preclinical data in support of the designation. It's also important to recognize that you may be required to demonstrate superiority if another drug for the same indication has already received marketing approval, and this will need to be included in your orphan drug application. You'll need to describe how you intend to demonstrate superiority. You don't necessarily need to have demonstrated it at that time, but your clinical development program needs to include a superiority trial to the already available therapy. It's also important to note in the U.S. in terms of the application itself that it is different from the IND. So orphan drug applications do not go through the IND. They go to the Office of Orphan Drug Products at FDA, which requires a different submission process. From the European perspective, by the European Medicines Agency, the requirement is that the disease prevalence be less than 5 in 10,000. Or, similar to the U.S., if the disease prevalence is higher than 5 in 10,000, that there are insufficient incentives to generate return. You must also demonstrate that you're intending to treat a life-threatening or seriously debilitating or serious and chronic condition. While not a requirement in the U.S., it is a requirement in the EU. So if you're looking to establish orphan in both regions, you'll want to address this particular point. Also, no satisfactory method of diagnosis, prevention, or treatment, and non-similarity to other orphan products for the same indication. Again, this highlights some of the main differences. As you work through the applications themselves, it's important to understand how you're going to approach this from a global perspective. If you're only looking in the US or only looking in the EU, then you can certainly just follow either the US FDA requirements or the European Medicines Agency requirements, but you'll need to consider that early in development. What are the key features of orphan designation in the US versus those of the EU with EMA. Beginning with FDA, market exclusivity of 7 years, NDA, BLA not subject to user fee, and a tax credit. With the EMA, market exclusivity of 10 years, fee reductions, direct access to centralized procedure, local national incentives, and separate licenses for orphan and non-orphan. So again, while there are different key features and different opportunities available, it is important to recognize that both in the US as well as in the EU, orphan designation is very key to moving programs forward. Sargon, now I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Christina. Yes, so going back to sort of continuing really, orphan drug designation. So from an EMA perspective, this has come from the EMA website. There are also several advantages which we discussed earlier. There are specific timelines on the EMA website, so really need to plan ahead. Make sure you are aware of those timelines and how they are worked out. It's important to know that that you are up to date with the timelines because they do change on a regular basis. So make sure you check back on those EMA website timelines when it comes to orphan drug designation. A pre-submission meeting prior to filing the application is advisable. This is important because it irons out any issues that could occur that can come up or they are not happy about. This will be highlighted to you by the colleagues at the EMA. And it's important to take note of what they are advising you because these questions will probably come back later. But it's good to have the pre-submission meeting prior to submitting your application. And obviously the applications are made electronically by the IRIS platform. They have the EMA. Next slide. Christine, over to you.
Thank you. Now I'd like to move on to talking about scientific advice in the United States with the Food and Drug Administration. So very early in the presentation, I mentioned that having scientific advice is really key to understanding if you meet the requirements for these potential designations and or pathways, and to ensure that you have alignment with the FDA in regards to your plan moving forward. So there are 4 types of formal meetings with FDA. They are Type A, Type B end of phase, and Type C. So beginning with Type A meetings, these are 30-day meetings, meaning that it's 30 days from submission to the meeting itself. The meeting request letter and the briefing package are due at the submission date, and therefore you do not have a delay between the meeting request letter and the briefing package itself. Types of meetings that fall into this category include dispute resolution, discussing clinical holds, special protocol assessments, and then meetings within 30 days of FDA issuance of a refuse to file letter. For rare and orphan diseases, typically you will not fall into a Type A category unless you find yourself in one of these circumstances. The most likely circumstance would be via a special protocol assessment. However, you might find yourself unable to move forward or in a stalled program, in which case you may have a dispute resolution meeting, or if your IND is placed on clinical hold, then you may need to discuss the clinical hold with FDA. One of the most common types is the Type B 60-day meeting, meaning that it is 60 days from submission of the meeting request letter to the meeting itself. The briefing package is due 30 days prior to the meeting. Most meetings are going to fall into this category when we discuss pre-IND meetings, which are very common, particularly for rare and orphan diseases, to ensure that you have alignment because you may be in more expedited development, so you may need to have earlier conversations about the overall development program. Other types of meetings that fall into this category, and particularly important for rare and orphan diseases, are, as I mentioned earlier, those products that have been granted breakthrough therapy designation. So if you have a breakthrough therapy designated product and you're looking to have a discussion with the agency outside of a pre-IND or pre-NDA, pre-BLA meeting, you may still be able to have that meeting within 60 days instead of the typical 75-day Type C meeting. Other types of meetings that are less common but fall into this category include post-action meetings for complete response letters, meetings to discuss run strategies, and those are typically the types of meetings that will fall into this category. There are also Type B end-of-phase meetings. These are 70 days and include end-of-phase 1 meetings as well as the end-of-phase 2 meeting. The briefing package is due significantly earlier than for other types of meetings to ensure that the agency has sufficient time to review for these critical milestone meetings. It's also important to recognize, particularly for pediatric indications, that the pediatric study plan is due 60 days after the end-of-phase 2 meeting. So when you schedule your Type B end-of-phase meeting, you also need to be prepared to submit that initial PSP within 60 days of the end of the meeting itself. Finally, there are Type C meetings. Type C meetings are 75 days long from submission of the meeting request letter to the meeting itself, and essentially any other topic or any other meeting with FDA falls into this category. So if you're outside of a major milestone but you're looking to address any particular CMC, preclinical, or any other clinical or clinical pharmacology issues that are not included in an end of phase or a pre-IND meeting, then it will fall into the Type C category. Before I move on, I just want to address the different formats of meetings with FDA. There are 3. They are written response only, teleconference, and face-to-face. It's important to understand that while you may request the type of meeting that you desire with FDA, ultimately, FDA has the final decision-making power in regards to the format of the meeting itself, so they will let you know if it will be written response only, teleconference, or face-to-face. I want to briefly just highlight one last time why scientific advice is important from both a regulatory perspective as well as an operational perspective. So from a regulatory perspective, we want to ensure that we're aligned with FDA on the development strategy, leading to fewer FDA queries and roadblocks. We also want to make sure that the proposed clinical development plan supports the marketing application, and we want to ensure that we have alignment on this before we get to the marketing stage in order that we don't end up with a complete response. These are critical milestone meetings to ensure that not just clinical, but also CMC and non-clinical development are on the appropriate pathway in order to be able to proceed to the next phase of development. And then finally, and critically for this discussion, we want to ensure that we're discussing these expedited, accelerated pathways and designations, that we're achieving these designations and using them to help speed up development or reduce the required clinical data to support an accelerated approach. From an operational perspective in terms of clinical trials, having scientific advice meetings ensures that there's a lower risk of clinical hold leading to delays in study startup, that there are fewer protocol amendments, because as we have greater alignment up front with FDA on things like dose, inclusion, exclusion criteria, endpoints, safety monitoring, what other protocol considerations, the better alignment that we have, the fewer amendments that should be necessary throughout the trial itself. And then importantly, early awareness and greater understanding of any potential challenges with availability of the investigational product in case there are any manufacturing gaps, so that those can be mitigated early on with scientific advice, and then we can help move forward with those without risking potential delays in the overall development program. Now I briefly want to shift into US FDA pediatric considerations. So as I mentioned, the pediatric study plan is due 60 days after the end of phase 2 meeting or before initiation of phase 3 trials if you do not have an end of phase 2 meeting. It should include CMC, non-clinical, and clinical considerations. You can request deferrals or waivers. In the case of a waiver, the application is shortened and only certain sections need to be completed. There's a 6-month patent extension. For rare or orphan indications with large numbers of pediatric patients, you may want to consider enrolling older age groups in adult trials, and this is something that you should discuss with the FDA as part of a scientific advice meeting, either at the end of phase 2 meeting or at the appropriate time in development. Sargon?
Thank you, Christina. Yes, I will. Obviously, I'm going to look from an EU perspective for a pediatric investigation plan, or the shortened form, a PIP. For EU, it's a legal requirement, and one thing you need to do and look at is understand the waivers, the deferrals, and the age groups. And you know, with regards to that, there are subsets that you have to understand from ages of 0 all the way to 18. So you need to look at that. Obviously, with a PIP, it can take up to 8 to 12 months for a PIP to be agreed. So allow time, allow for to discuss, to organize the PIP, and also to allow time to organize the PIP together. So it does take time. Be cautious of the time allowed, and also you time it in with the EMA requirements. You know, there is a possibility that you can request scientific advice in preparation of the PIP, and that's highly advisable. It is free of charge. However, for these questions, you need to have a set of questions that you want answered, and also to look at them in detail. Also, they can also allow follow-up of a PIP with scientific advice. So if you are thinking of a PIP, usually you would seek scientific advice before you submit the PIP. However, because the EMA discourages applicants to submit scientific advice and PIP application in parallel, so that's important to note. Please do refer to the Q&A section on the EM website, because it has a number of detail there, and also guidance on how to organize your PIP as well. Also, if you do seek scientific advice during your PIP, it is important that you seek PDCO agreement first before you seek that scientific advice. It's important to note. And that's the slide there. Thank you.
At this time, this concludes our presentation. I would like to thank all of you for your time, and now I will hand it over to the moderator.
Well, thank you very much for that insightful presentation. This does bring us to the Q&A portion of this webinar. I would like to invite our audience members to continue sending their questions or comments using the questions window. And we already received some questions, so I'll start off with those. So that first question is for Christina, and that question is, the timing for many of the FDA activities is very broad. Is there a way to determine when it's best to discuss with FDA and submit?
Thank you. That's a very good question. So I think the key when discussing timing for many of these FDA activities is to ensure that you have sufficient data to support your request. So for a lot of times, it may be sufficient to have an early conversation with FDA, for example, at a pre-IND meeting about your intent. But when you're actually looking at making an application for an expedited or accelerated pathway or designation, you want to ensure that you've really gone through each requirement and that you either have the clinical data to support, particularly if there are already approved therapies, or that you've really considered, the unmet medical needs, if there are no available therapies, and that you've at least demonstrated some initial efficacy to be able to support that application.
Great, thank you, Christina. And we do have another question, and that question is for Sargon, and that is it advisable to seek scientific advice early before asking for prime, orphan, or conditional MA?
Good question. I would say yes, definitely. It's important to get early engagement with a health authority. So simply is yes, you would do.
Great, thank you so much. And another question here, and that is, it seems as though FDA is not granting many F2F meetings, especially right now. How does this impact feedback that is received from FDA? Is it less detailed?
Absolutely. So, sorry, I'll go ahead and take that one. So I think obviously right now not a lot of face-to-face meetings are occurring. However, even before the current world situation, face-to-face meetings were generally declining, especially for pre-IND meetings with FDA, simply because of the large volumes of meetings that are being requested. We have not noted any drop-off in the depth of response when it's written responses or teleconferences. The FDA really does go through each question and provides quite detailed feedback, whether it's written response, teleconference, or face-to-face.
Great, thank you so much, Christina. And another question for Sargon. When should we apply for Prime?
Good question. The guidelines suggest EMA is around for Prime is early, very early development. Usually, when you're considering prior to phase one. So for me, it's the early engagement, the better, because they're not very successful if you do go later.
Great, thank you so much. And another question for Christina, and that question is, what is the current status of pediatric vouchers with FDA?
So currently, pediatric vouchers with FDA has always been a pretty high bar in order to achieve the designation, and very high in order to actually receive the voucher itself. What's important to understand is, as I mentioned during the presentation, there is right now a timing requirement with these pediatric vouchers, and that is end of September of this year. So September 30th, 2020 is the current deadline in order to receive these vouchers unless you have already received the designation. So if this is something that you think you qualify for and you're ready to move forward, then it's certainly something you're going to want to discuss with the agency sooner rather than later. Now, there is always the possibility, as I mentioned, that the timeline gets extended based on Congress or FDA or other considerations, but for now, it's important to understand that deadline.
Thank you, Christina. And a question for Sargon, and that question is, when should we seek accelerated assessment? Is there a specific time point?
As I said previously, I think it's important to note that it should be very early. Usually, what I've said, it's I think in one of my slides, it's before your. I'm trying to think what slide it was. I think it's before you are applying for your MAA.
Great, thank you so much, Sargon. And a question for Christina. What criteria or product details would make it appropriate to apply for orphan drug designation prior to having efficacy data?
So I'm gonna discuss U.S. orphan from a U.S. perspective, and I think what you would want is at least some preclinical data to support efficacy as you move forward. Having clinical data, of course, is preferred, but if you have sufficient preclinical data that you can at least provide within the application itself, then this approach can sometimes be acceptable, particularly in cases where there's no approved therapy. If you're having to demonstrate superiority because there's already an approved therapy on the market, then this approach might not be sufficient.
Great, thank you so much. And no more questions so far. If you do have more questions, continue sending them. And well, thank you very much for all those answers, Sargon and Christina. We've reached the end of the question and answer portion of this webinar. If you were unable to attend your questions during today's session, the team at Medpace may try to follow up with you later on as well. And if you have any more lingering questions, you can also direct them to the email address showing on your screen. So that's info@medpace.com. And thank you everyone for participating in today's conference. You will be receiving a follow-up email from XTalks with access to the recorded archive for this event. Now, please join us in giving a big thank you to Christina Wanderhar and Sargon Daniel for that fantastic presentation. And feel free to share the recorded version of this webinar when it becomes available. We hope you found this conference informative. Have a great day, everyone. Take care.